So I spent the better part of my childhood hunched over this mid-century brown spruce and maple console piano that I believe first belonged to my great aunt, and where she would hammer out hymns in preparation for church services and exercise her extremely impressive ragtime skills for the general amusement and charming merriment of easily the most musical side of my entire family. Not that the other sides aren't doing their best, I'm sure they are. It's the same upright piano that my mother, by her own right, a very impressive pianist, vocalist, and, if we're keeping track, the most central figure to my entire musical journey, so thanks, Mom, where she first learned the instrument. And from the mid-'80s to the mid-aughts, it served as practice piano for my sister and me. Enrolled in lessons, both active participants in church music, and both generally fond of the kind of tinkering that produces sticky melodies reminiscent of songs pulled from the stacks of used CDs we fished from wire-framed store shelves and absorbed in our spare time. I was never the most consistent practice. I opted mostly to rely on above-average sight-reading abilities and a good ear. I'll give myself that. But even when I'm visiting for holidays or if I'm in town for less joyful gatherings, regardless, I like to find time to fine-tune my rudimentary skills by getting lost at the piano for a minute, observing it in its newest environment, wherever that may be, watching another generation of children discover it by banging around on it. It's a percussion instrument, after all, so in their defense, is stealing some one-on-one time on it to practice alone, because music for funerals makes people sad. It's such a significant collection of strings and bridges and soundboards and hammers that I can feel the texture of its varnish and the weight of its keys imprinted at various points on my personal memory. A map unto its own making that uses the most intimately familiar to form new terrain. It's something I've learned as some time has passed, how this ordinary object collapses under the weight of the very meaning that it gave rise to, how this thing, committing a self-sacrificial act by giving way to a force that allows me to move further outward in expression and articulation. I love our precious little machines. These objects fished from artisan makers and specialty shops, passed between family members, retail stores and yard sales and flea markets, and inserted into our daily lives to varying degrees of impact. It's the kind of magic that lies scattered around us all over, at our feet, waiting to remind us that an instrument makes the best leisure time and an instrument can make Wagner, This immersion in church music is a really interesting family tradition that, from all I can tell, stems originally from some kind of need. That is the need for more church musicians to play piano and organ in eastern Kentucky country churches for often quite devoted, but sparse audiences. It wasn't always, or even often, a pleasant experience to shuffle into a church extremely early on a Sunday morning, or later on a Wednesday evening, to practice songs specifically designed to encourage people to make financial contributions. But I would be lying if I said that these experiences failed to impact me in various ways, big and small. I was raised in a Christian denomination that stems from the holiness movements of the late 19th century United States, and inspired by the teachings of English Protestant reformers from the century before them. These restorationists followed a man called Daniel Warner as they sought originally to establish congregations on the rule of Scripture and profession of personal belief for membership, and as foundational principles in the governance of their churches, basically. Something that they thought could ultimately unify Christians. It's just so to say that lay participation in the church body is something that my family takes very seriously and with great pride. When the doors were open, we were there. Anyone else grow up super religious? I know this is a really common experience for a lot of people under various Christian and, let's face it, probably non-Christian religious denominations, so maybe some of you understand how it felt almost inevitable when the roots of church music, so firmly planted before I was even born, began to grow out into other parts of my day-to-day comings and goings. Perhaps by natural occurrence, perhaps by necessity in an attempt to find some external mode of expression or source of validation that remained generally permissible, so to speak. I don't know. How music, even when it's rooted in this small and very specific environment and practice, unlocked something in me that would go on to influence pretty much every decision I made for the first 25 years of my life. Got a guitar at a flea market, started learning that around the same time that I got to 6th grade, and was introduced to my public school's string orchestra, so I found a good excuse to play music during school hours. And then again through college, I used it to pay some bills for a short time, which was alright. I got introduced to Elgar and Shostakovich and Steve Reich. Successfully banged out work from some of these greats and others on a machine-made student cello, so jokes on everyone who had to play with me, I guess. But eventually much of this gave way to something very different when I found myself dealing with the nagging persistence of extreme music, DIY, and the writhing, ecstatic spirit of live hardcore as a younger man. Oh, buddy. Yeah. It's funny how even after successfully using the Christian church and public school system to find footing in symphonic and orchestral music, I found my biggest audiences and longest lasting music related friendships in these DIY spaces, skate parks. Shoutouts to 688 in Clearwater and the skate park in Tampa, where working class kids got a chance to speak to modest but generally receptive audiences about the people in our families who were being hounded by medical debt collectors and really our friends and our loved ones who just couldn't afford anything. All of it blasted through equipment gathered steadily from pawn shops and other local musicians, you know. It's amazing the kind of noise you can make from hymnals and piano lessons, if I'm any indication. I feel particularly indebted to this slice of family and personal history because music is fundamental to the way that I experience the world. The interlocking mechanism that composes my self-expression, holding all this mixture of personal meaning and social and familial interaction and tradition and ineffable excess of extraordinary experience into a shape that clangs and chimes and bangs with meaning. The way my family has encountered and re-encountered music over some generations is emblematic of how, despite various positions or stations, we make use of what's been presented to us. How this helps us attune to a sense of the world, despite all the rest of things. How the inconspicuous collections and wanderings and ramblings of a random gay man from Florida, for example, can feel more than the sum of its parts, maybe. Items from my personal life, unemotionally discarded and left to this process of refashioning and presentation and curation by larger forces that honestly don't give a shit. And fine, so be it. I'm not shy about the methodological influence this very personal approach has had on the way that I write and think about history, a way conveniently or serendipitously, informed by Walter Benjamin's Transfiction on Baudelaire's Rag Picker at Midnight, this half-tanked poet, piecing through the day's refuse in a sort of prismatic concerto accompanied by the percussion of crashing rubble, the subtle fluttering of winged things out past their bedtime, the rhapsody of strings that spring up when it's dark and the moon is so big. This is my central, aspirational figure in the writing of history, the hobo poet. A reminder of how the ordinary and discarded are gifts we share in our memories, our shared joy and sorrow, our symphony of reflective melancholy. All of this is just music, waiting to be made.